Hi everyone, so for this week for Crim 210 we're going to be focusing on racism and anti-racism as well as some of the descriptions of why overrepresentation of Indigenous persons possibly exists within the justice system, including the youth justice system. We're going to start by looking back at some youth justice policy, and this is some information that you've already been exposed to, but now we're going to begin to think more about whether this policy is actually having an impact on reducing the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth. So when we look at, for example, the Criminal Code of Canada, or if we look at the Youth Criminal Justice Act, we can see different sections meant to try and reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous persons. So for example, Section 38(2)(d) of the Youth Criminal Justice Act suggests that when judges are considering a sentence, they need to consider for everybody all alternatives to custody that might be reasonable in the circumstances, and that judges must be giving particular attention to the circumstances of Indigenous young persons. So judges are being told when they make their sentencing decisions to consider, for example, the mitigating circumstances such as systemic racism that might warrant a reduced sentence for Indigenous persons. Similarly, if we look at the declaration principle of the YCJ, it again reiterates that it's important to respond to the unique needs of Indigenous persons. And one of these unique needs, or one way to take stock of these unique needs, is through a Gladue report, which is also sort of enshrined in the Canadian Criminal Code when we look at sentencing decisions under Section 718(2)(e). And basically, this is a report that is required to be written typically by a probation officer that will give consideration to the cultural experiences of the First Nations group, for example, that an Indigenous person might come from. So within a Gladue report, typically probation officers will receive specific training, and this training will require them to basically have an understanding of a youth's heritage, a description of some of the systemic or background factors that might be influencing not just involvement in the justice system, but even things like marginalization in other ways, experiences of oppression or poor health outcomes, education outcomes, and so on. And then the report needs to consider how the young person is situated within their community and within their heritage. Unfortunately, what we continue to see today in Canada's criminal justice system is an overrepresentation of Indigenous persons in our court populations. It usually ranges around 25 to 30%. And it's sometimes higher in some of the provinces towards the prairies. It's really important not to just memorize the statistic. Yes, you do need to know the statistic, but you need to begin to consider, why does this overrepresentation exist? And some of the reasons might have to do with things like also an overrepresentation of a history of experiences of substance abuse or witness to parental substance abuse, witness to forms of violence, exposure to violence, but also concerns that are more systemic. So not just the individual and their experiences, but the experiences of the communities that they are a part of. And this can include things like concerns about over-policing of marginalized groups. Another thing that we've talked about in this class, where police will allocate resources to the areas that they perceive to have the highest crime rates. And then as a consequence of that, those groups get over-policed, increasing the likelihood that they're going to be detected for involvement in criminal behavior, whereas other individuals in possibly more affluent communities are less likely to be detected for their involvement in crime. Explanations of overrepresentation aren't just about what is happening today. We need to look back at how historical factors have influenced this overrepresentation. When we look at developmental and life course criminology, we know that there's a big emphasis on the intergenerational transmission of different negative social outcomes, including the intergenerational transmission of abuse. But we can also begin to look at things like the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And this goes all the way back to basically colonialism, when we can see the impact of genocide on Indigenous persons and the long-term mistreatment of Indigenous persons thereafter. We can definitely also see, for example, evidence that offenses by Indigenous persons may be more likely to be prosecuted, result in justice system processing. Another reason for overrepresentation could be related to systemic racism, whether it's in communities, police forces. Like, it's not just a policing issue. we want to take a look at policing, obviously, because that's where we're going to see a big intersection of police and persons involved in crime. But we also have to think about how even just everyday systemic racism can have an influence on involvement in criminal behavior. It's also important to recognize cultural differences, and again, not just cultural differences between Indigenous persons and the traditional white European justice system, but also other underrepresented groups. Whether it is Black, Indigenous, other persons of color, there are these cultural differences that can impact how one individual experiences justice system processing. And when you have, for example, in particular communities or cultures, a great emphasis on community building, that impact of being taken out of that community or feeling like you're no longer part of that community because you're involved in a crime can have a particularly damaging impact on a person's ability to experience rehabilitation.